In this lesson, I will show you how we can add some motion blur to our animation. First of all, let's close all our properties here and then make sure that you have the same layout in your timeline panel. So you can toggle these modes right here with this toggle switch. Make sure that these options here are visible. You can also change these options by pressing F4 on your keyboard. And as I already showed you when we were talking about the parenting, if something is not visible here, you can come up here to this column here and right click, and then you can choose which columns you want to enable. And right now what we want to have is we want the switches to be visible. So if these are not visible, come in here, click right, choose columns, and then activate our switches. To activate motion blur for a layer, you can activate the motion blur setting here. So just click in here to activate it. And actually we can activate this for all of our layers, but we do not need to activate it for our video files because they are actually not animating and not moving. So let's select all our layers. I select this layer, then I can hold down Shift and select the circle layer, so all of the in-between layers will be selected. Then I hold down Control, select my watercolor stain, and my watercolor stain 2 layer. We do not need to add any motion blur to our background because this doesn't move. So with all these layers selected, I now can come in here and activate the motion blur for these layers. You see that by default nothing is changing. So if I create a RAM preview with my work area still set to 3 seconds, so let's click space to make a RAM preview, you see it looks exactly as before. And this is because you have to activate motion blur right here on top of the composition. You see that if I hover over this icon here, this button enables motion blur for all layers with the motion blur switch set. So now let's activate this. Now for each of these layers where we activated the motion blur will be rendered. So again, let's create a RAM preview. And you see that now the animation looks a little bit more dynamic. Now let's take a look what settings we have and how we can manipulate the appearance of our motion blur. So let's move our cursor right in the beginning here where we have some motion blur going on, and then let's enter our composition settings. We can enter the composition settings by pressing Ctrl and K. So let's take a look here at our Advanced tab. In the Advanced tab you see here we have some motion blur settings. First of all, we have the shutter angle setting. The shutter angle setting is measured in degrees, and it is simulating the exposure that is allowed by a rotating shutter. So this is more or less simulating the behavior of standard cameras. If you increase the shutter angle, then the motion blur will become more intense. So let's do this. Let's type in here 720, for example. And when I do this, you see that now the motion blur will get more intense and more obvious. Let's go back to Ctrl and K to open up the composition settings again. And if I decrease this, let's say to a really low number, then you see that nearly no motion blur is going on. So the standard setting here is 180 degrees. In our case, because the animation is very short, I want to increase this a little bit. So let's increase this to 270 degrees. Like so, I like this. The next option that we have here is the shutter phase, and the shutter phase is also measured in degrees. And if you change this to a negative degree, if you take a look here at then you see that it changes the point in time, or it defines the offset that determines when the shutter is open relative to the beginning of the frame. So this is mostly used if an object appears to be lagged behind. So if you see that an object feels like it's a little bit lagged behind, then you can change the shutter phase. The standard value here is 90, minus 90. And yeah, usually there's no need to change this. But if you have the feeling that something is wrong with your motion blur, then you could come in here and experiment with the shutter phase. The samples per frame determine the quality of your motion blur. So let's set this to a really low number. Let's set this to 4, for example. And you do not see it right here, but if I click OK now, and let's zoom in here to our full resolution. So let's click in here, let's select full, and let's click in here and let's change the zoom level to 100% to make our motion blur a little bit more obvious. Now let's press Ctrl K again to open these settings and go to the Advanced tab. And if I decrease the adaptive sample limit too, so let's decrease this to about a very low number like 8. Then you see what's happening. Now we see the samples here because the sample rate is very low. Of course, this will render way faster than with high sample rates, but you see that you lose a lot of quality. So here you have to find the right balance between render time and quality. In our case, it's no problem because our animation is really short. So I will increase this again to the standard settings of 32 samples. And you see the quality gets better instantly. And if I increase this now to 128 again, then we have a really nice and high quality motion blur. Okay, so this is the motion blur. Let's create a final RAM preview. Hit space. Let's take a look how this looks like. And I think that this really adds to the quality of our animation and makes it way more dynamic. In the next video, I want to push the look of this a little bit further, and we will take a look at layer styles in After Effects.